So I'm very grateful to be gathered with you guys. It means a ton to me. So I just wanted to share a stream of consciousness.
Oh, yummy.
In preparation for Sukkot. What is a sukkah? They appear, the existence of Sukkot already shows itself in the Torah and in a couple places. There's a place called Sukkot that is mentioned as one of the places that the Jewish people go to after we leave Egypt. There's a place called Sukkot. And also when Yaakov Avinu, after he has his encounter with Esau, it says that he went to this he went to Shechem, to this place, and he bought some land. And it says there that he built the Sukkot for his animals. It's very possible that the initial purpose of Sukkot was some kind of shelter for animals. I mean, that's what it seems like from Yaakov. As we look backwards from our experience, the essential element of the sukkah is the schach, the roof part. You could make the walls out of any material. You can make the walls out of any material, but the roof has to be made of special materials. It has to be something that grows from the ground, is not attached to the ground anymore. But it's not in a developed state. It can't be something that's already been made into something. It has to be rough, as it were. And by its nature, it's not a sturdy roof. It's not a sturdy roof. It's if it rained, rain could get through. So it's primarily the roof.
Here, Bobby, can I see it on your phone?
It's primarily the roof that is giving the sukkah its name after the notion of schach.
Can I go out of it for a second?
The walls could be.
You do whatever you want. Wait, he spit up all over himself.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So the walls can be made out of any material. So in theory, you could have a room in your house, and there's some people who do this. You have a room in your house that's made of the same materials that your house is, very sturdy, and with a retractable roof that you put schach on, and that would be a halachically acceptable sukkah. We tend to talk about the sukkah being a temporary dwelling, and that one of the very important parts of the experience of the sukkah is moving out of the sturdiness of our home into something where you're more vulnerable and sort of live in trust of God, which tends to be required when you're feeling more vulnerable. But when we talk about that, I mean, technically working back from the halacha, what we're talking about is the roof part. So most likely, if we're working backwards, based on what we know about sukkah now, if you're working backwards and you look, and this is like anachronistic to do this, but if you look backwards and assume that the elements that we know about sukkah nowadays are present in the sukkahs that they had, so most likely the protection they're providing is from the sun. They had these kind of structures for guards, people standing guard out in fields. They're not going to protect you necessarily from a storm, from a windstorm, from a rainstorm, but they would protect you from the sun. You know, they would give you some shelter. And yeah. So thinking about that just got me wondering about houses. How did we get to this situation where owning a house matters so much? Like, why does owning a house matter so much to people?
No, they're relative, I'll tell you. Explain. Well, commission. Right.
So when I think about a house, what matters to me is first and foremost the protection from the elements. In the past, I've gone camping a lot, and when you're in a tent, you experience that vulnerability and you get a renewed appreciation for the solid protection of a house. And the more solid, the more protection. You think about RVs in a tornado or a flood. A lot of times when images are shown of devastation from hurricanes or tornadoes or floods, a lot of times there will be pictures from RV parks. Mm-hmm. So that's a step up, obviously, from a tent, but it's still not that kind of protection when there's big storms. And I've been in an RV when there's been big storms, and you feel very vulnerable. So having solid four walls and a roof,
good thing.
Safety, security, and then owning it as opposed to renting it, because if you rent it, you don't know. The landlord may decide that you no longer can rent and you might be out of a place, and then what am I going to be in? There's a sense of vulnerability. So owning a house is owning security and stability. And then there's more that we add to it. If we have a family in the house, it becomes identified with our family, our home life starts to get to attached to it. There are certainly children who grew up in homes that their parents kept for many years, and then their parents decide they're going to sell it, and the children have to come to terms with it. Yeah, come to terms with the fact that the place that they so identified, not just, for them, they don't necessarily know, hopefully don't know insecurity and vulnerability, but for them, it's the home, the memories associated with it, which are memories of family. So we like layer things into it. There are people whose public identity is associated with their house. Their communal identity is associated with their house. there's a neighborhood in Israel that Sippy and I lived in for 8 years. It's called Kiryat Kamenetz. And when that neighborhood began, we moved in right at the beginning. As the housing was finishing, they built, I think, like 250 units. And they were like 2 levels. There was 1 unit, and then there was a unit higher up. But it was constructed in such a way that there was like this parking lot around which a lot of the housing was. So it just created this kind of natural community. And people felt very close to each other. Everybody, you owned your own place, like condos. And when we moved in for Israel size apartments, it was an apartment you're going to be in. For, many of our friends are still in those same places. Their kids all grew up in them, and they so we haven't lived there for 30 years. But when I go back to visit, my friends tell me they still call that the Karsh house, the place where we were. It was because we all sort of moved in together. Our kids grew up together in that area. And there's something just very warming, about knowing that there's a place that is associated with you. So so it becomes the way you are seen by the community, and the way, and your sort of entree into the community. For much of history, being a homeowner meant you were a full citizen, and you had a say in what happens in the area. So somehow, it starts with this thing, which is safety and security, but then layers get added onto it that become important to us. In our culture, in American culture, being a homeowner is almost considered a right. The people should have a right to it, and then the path to homeownership should be available to everybody, and that it's the government's responsibility to make sure that there is such a thing. The notion of affordable housing, it's not just that people could afford rents, but that you could afford what's called the American dream, is to own a house. So particularly in our culture, owning a home and having a house is considered a part of what it means to live as a citizen. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it wasn't always that way. If you look back to Abraham lived in tents, and he didn't always live in the same place. He did not own the land that he was living on. He did buy land. He bought land to bury Sarah, to bury his wife. He bought land, but he did not buy land. Yaakov bought land in the north, in Shem, in that area near Shem. But Abraham didn't, and Yitzchak didn't. Yitzchak did not have land that he owned. He lived in tents, and he moved around. Even Yaakov, it appears to be a period of time where he sort of settled down into something that he bought, but then eventually he left there, and his family lived in tents. It's one of the surprising things. It's been surprising to me for years that Abraham is promised that one day he's going to have this land for his children, and it means so much to him when he himself doesn't seem to have valued that in his own life. He himself, I don't know if we have evidence of him at all being even interested in an agrarian lifestyle. He raises sheep and cattle, and he leads a nomadic existence. Yitzchak does plant, but there's no indication that he owned the land that he planted on. I don't know what his deal was. I don't know how he was able to plant crops without owning it. I mean, there's no discussion of him buying land
or anybody kicking him off any piece of land.
Well, they made life a bit difficult by contesting the wells in the area where he lived. But like when he was planting those crops, what was his deal? He wasn't even in Israel. I mean, he wasn't in what was called Canaan. He was in the Philistine territories when he starts planting these crops. What was his deal? Why was he allowed to plant crops there? I don't even know. I don't know what, it seems like you didn't have to own property, or if he did buy something there, for some reason, the Torah doesn't mention it. They do mention it by Yaakov. They do mention when Avram buys Marsa Machpelah, but they don't mention anything over there. And for the most part, most of his life, he seems to have led a nomadic existence, just like his father. And Yaakov seems to have continued that nomadic existence for most of their time. So it's sort of funny that they're promised that they're going to have this land, and there's going to be, and then the promise continues, like to the people when they're in the desert, that eventually that they're going to have this land and parcels of land, and you're going to be static. You're going to have this place. You're not just going to be static for a certain period of time. You're static for all times. You're going to have a piece of land. It's going to be your land. And you're expected to live on that land, and your children are, and your grandchildren are, etc. And if you fall on hard times and you have to sell it, it comes back to you. This notion of having ancestral property in one location. For nomads, it's not even desired. When you hear about gypsies or peoples that are nomadic, Bedouins, it was a big issue for Israel. They were trying to get Bedouins to move into more stable housing, and it's a tremendous struggle. I think continues to be a struggle in Israel to get them to move into a situation like that. So it's one of these sort of surprising things that you have nomadic people that are being promised that they're going to have land that is their own, and they're going to have a static kind of existence tied to that particular land. Rabbi Foreman points out that one of the distinctions between Avraham and the people who built the Tower of Babel, Migdal Bavel, there were a few distinctions between them, but one of the distinctions is they tried to make a structure out of brick that would last and would have a name, would create a name for themselves. When Avraham refused, Avraham lived in tents and moved around. He wasn't interested in that track that the people of the time of Migdal Bavel were set on, establishing permanence, establish structures that go to the skies. I once was watching a PBS program devoted to the sociologist. He's immensely famous. He did a lot of work on the fact that cultures around the world share symbols. Campbell, Joseph Campbell. And that for whatever reason, the section that I was watching, he was talking about how you can tell a lot about a society by their tallest buildings or their most impressive buildings, not always tallest, but tall was a big part of it, or just most dramatic buildings. So there's a period of time where it's the temples, to the gods or churches, that they always had to be the tallest. You couldn't build something taller than that. And then there were stadiums that became the dramatic feature in the cities. And then at the time where he was talking, the tallest buildings were associated with finance, like the World Trade Center or things like that. So he was pointing out that the buildings that we make that are the most dramatic speak about our values. And this is evident at the Tower of Babel. This is what was going on at the Tower of Babel. So one of the ways in which Abraham is a kind of non-Babylonian, non-Mesopotamian in his life, one of the decisions he made is that he's never going to have a structure like that, a permanent structure. He's going to have a tent. He's going to move from place to place. Even hundreds of years later, maybe 1,000 years after Abraham, when David he communicates that he wants to build a house for God. The first reaction through the prophet is, I don't need a house. I'm fine in the tent. Yeah, there is a Mishkan. The Mishkan is distinguished from a house in that it is a temporary structure and is capable of moving from place to place.
Now we've got one on every corner.
Houses. You're talking about houses like a shul, you mean? Yeah. But then he does agree to the notion he's going to have, Shlomo's going to build it, but he agrees to a Beis Hamikdash. But even the Beis Hamikdash, our relationship to the Beis Hamikdash is, it was a building and it was an important building, but it didn't last.
No.
And we became a people once again on the move. Without access to a structure. Heschel, in his book about the Sabbath, which is called The Sabbath, even makes this point. He says that the Torah, when the Torah speaks about sanctity in a particular area, it first speaks of sanctity in time. The first thing that is sanctified, the first time the word sanctity is used, is with regard to Shabbos. It says that God sanctified it. By Kadesh also, he sanctified it. He blessed it and he sanctified it. And only much later on is there discussion about sanctity in place. and the main force of his work is to explore that notion of sanctity in time, which Shabbos represents. But he talks about the various advantages of sanctity in time over sanctity in space. And one of them is because sanctity in space is not always accessible. And especially if we're in exile, people who live in exile, who tend to wander. So we can't rely on sanctity in one place, one holy place, whereas sanctity in time, it's always available. We tend to meet in time. What are you doing on Shabbos? You want to come over for Shabbos? What are you doing for Pesach? You want to come over for Pesach? These are opportunities to gather in time, and they're always available, no matter what circumstance you're in. Whereas sanctity in space, you have to have access to that place in order to be able to access the sanctity. Nowadays, let's say you own a house. What is the likelihood that you're going to stay in that house for decades?
Highly likely.
You think so?
I lived in my house for
No,
40
you.
years.
No, you personally.
Yes.
But I'm saying nowadays, what is the average? It's like 7 years or something like that. Something 7 or 8 years that people. It's become more common for people to move, and not to remain tied to a particular house. We hear stories about people who had some kind of estate in their family for hundreds of years in England or something like that. And they are tales of yore. And they were also always only something available to people of the aristocracy. They were not, it wasn't something that was available to the average person. It just does not seem like life on this plane of existence supports the idea of having a solid structure in one place that you're tied to for your entire life. Life is always changing. And having a home, being tied to a home, encourages a mindset that suggests that you can just walk in through a door and change doesn't need to happen. That you can somehow swim against the tide, fight the tides of change if you have a house. It's part of the safety and security. Once I walk inside there, I'm in a realm that's protected from outside forces that would do battle with the things that I consider most important. But if you zoom out, it seems like that is a futile battle. At least our history seems to bear that out as a people. Even Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in an essay in his Haggadah volume, they have essay section. So he gave a speech at Windsor Castle, and Prince Philip was in attendance. It was a great honor to give this speech. And he spoke about the responsibilities of English nobility to preserve the past, and how one of those tasks was preserving castles like Windsor Castle, in order to carry with them the English past into the present and to the future. And he said that the Jewish people have a similar task handed to them, but it's not buildings, it's ideas. It's life lessons. That Pesach is part of that. Talking about it and then passing it on to the next generation. Even there, he seems to be contrasting the Jewish experience with cultures that have structures and buildings and things like that. If you look back from Sukkot towards the Jewish people at our beginnings, whether the beginnings with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or the beginnings of the Jewish people as they leave Egypt, when you look back and you think about this notion of Sukkot, I mean, what did they think? It does seem like in Egypt, they lived in houses. There's reference to a mezuzah, the doorposts, that they put blood on their doorposts. Right. That is not a reference you would make if they were living in tents. So it does seem like in Egypt they were living in houses. But they are not living in houses when they are in the desert. And then they're told that there's going to be this holiday. They're told it while they're in the desert. They're told there's going to be this holiday, Sukkot. And one of the primary mitzvahs of this holiday is to build Sukkot. Now, why? Because God says that while they were in the desert, he had them living in Sukkot. Is there any indication from the text that they actually lived in sukkahs while they were in the desert? When Balaam talks about it, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, how good are your tents? He talks about them living in tents. Right, right. So it could be that what he means is temporary structures, and that tents was meant to be included in it. And that this isn't a big find, that it says Kiva Sukkot or Shavti B'nai Israel, I had them living in Sukkot. Where do you ever see them living in sukkahs? Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe sukkahs includes tents, and it's just talking about temporary dwellings. But the people are being told that even in the future, you're going to have a holiday where you build a sukkah, which implies that they're not going to live in sukkahs in the future. Right. It is not the plan for the future. The plan for the future is they're going to live in houses, because otherwise, this experience of the sukkah is not meaningful. If they already live in sukkahs when they're in Israel, it's not going to be a big deal. If you ask them to build another one, it must be in contrast to what they're going to be living in, which would mean that they're living in houses when they're in the land of Israel. So not only is the plan again for them to have fixed territory each individual family to have fixed territory, but the plan is for them to live in houses. And then for a week out of the year, you're going to go back to living in a sukkah. It's just such a strange thing to me, this house business. Why did he have them live in Sukkot while they were in the desert?
Easier to move.
Yeah, they're traveling, so practically they need it. But it's also possible that if you don't need to have a house, this is what I was sort of thinking about. If you don't need to have a house, there's no point to having a house. In other words, if you're completely safe and secure, then why do you need this structure
Climate
to feel safe in? So so let's say you live in a climate where there is no risk to you. I mean, and it would have to be a moderate climate, and the weather couldn't get that extreme. But let's say you could have tent material, and tent material would protect you enough from the weather, and you didn't have to be concerned about marauders or thieves or other kinds of people breaking in. Then you wouldn't. I would argue not only would you not need a house, would be silly to have a house, but again, it may send the wrong message to have a house. That because if you don't need the safety and security of it, then why are you building it? Why are you doing it? For what?
For all your stuff.
But you're again, we're talking about a situation where you don't have to lock your stuff away.
Right.
It's like teepee. Why would, if everyone was living in teepees, it'd be weird if one person built a brick house.
Yeah, well, like the guy who goes out and builds a brick house, right? In a culture where, so if you're living in an area where your safety is assured, then it would be sort of silly to build a house.
Show a lack of trust.
Yeah.
You wonder if you weren't trustworthy.
Right. So in the desert, where we are enveloped in God's embrace by the clouds of glory, and we're under his protection, there is no need for houses. But having, so it's only going to be for a future time, when we apparently are going to feel less safe, or that and less protected. So 1 week out of the year, we remind ourselves that there is a cost that you pay for living in a solid structure. There are potential hazards that we encounter when we live in a solid structure. And one of them is that we can believe that we don't need God's protection as much. We don't need God's help that much in our life because we have solid walls around us. And another thing, perhaps, is that resistance to change or denial of the fact that things change, which is also possible with a home.
So true.
It's not realistic to live in tents in Northbrook. You wouldn't be allowed to.
Probably wouldn't be safe either.
Right.
We'd have to buy the house and then you can build a tent in the backyard.
Put the
Would they
tent
let
in the
you?
back.
I don't know. I mean,
I always had a dream. I thought it would be funny. Like there are these people that build statement homes, even in West Riders Park. You have these guys who knock down like 2 houses and they build one of these giant houses in this area that has only little houses. Now there's more of these giant houses, so it doesn't look as strange as it did when they were first doing it. But I thought like a real statement home, like if I like you had all these guys who were building these big houses,
Tent in the front yard.
or RV.
Yeah. Oh,
I
yeah.
thought it would be funny to build an enormous house with a driveway and then not live in the house, live in the RV, which is parked in my driveway in the front, just to show I could do it. But I insist on living in an RV. It's just weird that we live in houses. It's weird if you look back at our history. It's just weird. But we've come to the point where the sukkah is what's weird, or the tent is what's weird. But really, it's houses. What is even like? Typically, there's a foundation built into the Torah for an idea. Like the ideas, like land ownership. The idea of land ownership does have a foundation. That does. I mean, because we're told that eventually the land is going to be divided up amongst the tribes. We have the stories, the daughters of Slavchad, which we've been studying about in Daf Yomi, where they're even talking about the importance of their father having a heritage in the land. Having a connection to land is funny to me that we do it, but there you at least have a precedent. But there's like, what is the precedent for having houses? There's like, it doesn't really, except for the Tower of Babel, really, you don't have like a structure, like there actually, now that I think about it, there is a case. It's the tzara'at of a house. The tzara'at of a house. Yeah. So over there it talks about stone, like taking it apart. You have to take the house apart if it has whatever this kind of affliction, this house, which is called tzara'at of the house, that at some point you have to take the house apart stone by stone. So there is an indication that people will have stone houses, but just the whole thing, the foundation of it, why, what is the value of it? We do even have celebrations. We have Chanukah Sabayis. We have a celebration when somebody moves into a house. You can actually have like a celebratory meal that is like a dedication of a house. So we do have it in custom, but it just seems like something that is so. We've explored this in the past, like this notion that we have attachments to things. What is that? What does it mean that we have an attachment to an object? But we do, some kind of psychological attachment to things. And we have attachment to place. And we have attachment, certainly, to a notion of a home. That we identify it with our person. It becomes part of our self-identity. Mm-hmm. But it's such a strange thing.
And sometimes it gets tied into your self-worth, which is not a good thing.
Right. Yeah. That's that line that we cross. It's just such a strange thing, us and houses.
Exactly.
and how important they've become in our culture. But why? Like, what is it? And it comes at a cost. So those are some of the things I'm going to be thinking about when I'm sitting in the sukkah. Hopefully,
Hope it doesn't rain.
Hopefully the weather will support sitting in a sukkah. So both to reflect on those aspects of what a house is, and also to bask in God's divine embrace. The sukkah, we have two options for the sukkah. One is that the people actually were housed in sukkahs. The other option mentioned is in the Gemara is that the sukkah represents the clouds of glory, which are this divine embrace. And that's the one we go with. That's the halachic one. The decision is that we follow that one. So that'll be part of it, is thinking for, living with that opportunity of faith and trust, and living with a kind of divine hug during the week, but also sort of getting a chance to reflect on the folly of trying to build something permanent in an ever-changing world, and thinking that I need, for some reason, extra safety and security when there's an opportunity, when that all should exist in my relationship with God.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Since one of your ideas of when you daven, when you're praying, is walking through the temple,
yeah,
or through this, so
right.
Is this incorporated the fact that God needs a house?
Well, no, but that thing is, you see the resistance. It's not fully explained why he gives in. He resists it. He resists it with David originally. David wants to do it, and God says, "You think I need a house?"
Fine where I am.
Right. He seems to resist it initially, and when I do that, like that meditation, like during davening, where I'm going from one place to another in the Beit HaMikdash, sometimes I do it in the Mishkan, where I'm in the Mishkan, and in many ways, when I'm doing it in the Mishkan, it's more intimate and warm. There's something more intimate and warm about it being a tent than being a solid structure with stone and gold and metals. They don't. My image of it, based on the descriptions in the Gemara and pictures that people have produced based on those descriptions, is something more cold, not as warm. Whereas the Mishkan, as I imagine it, and I experience it during my meditations when I'm walking through it, feels much warmer. And by the way, that is a thing that can happen in a tent. Is it feels, if the weather's okay and you're in the tent, it's actually, there's a cozy kind of warmth that happens in a tent, which is available, so interestingly, in a tent, which is not always available in a house. Okay, those are just some thoughts, some streams of consciousness that are indulging in preparation for Sukkot. I wish you a beautiful Sukkot. I wish you a safe and healthy Sukkot. May Hashem send us Mashiach Tzidkenu speedily, and a resolution to all the suffering that we and our people are going through, so that we can have a truly spectacular Sukkot free of worries from the outside. All right, be well.